Welcome everyone to the Intelligence Spotlight series. As always, we are trying our best to bring people and experts in the fields of justice, accountability, intelligence, information warfare, investigative journalists, and basically people who are dealing with informations, and that their information could be used for various reasons, especially in the case of accountability. And that's precisely what today's topic is about. We have a very distinguished guest, Kornelia Georgieva. She's an intelligence analyst and investigator with over a decade of experience in international justice and the rule of law. She has worked with the UN's IIM and Commission of Inquiry on Syria, as well as the Commission for International Justice and Accountability, advancing investigations into war crimes, crimes against humanity, and conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence. A Justice Rapid Response roasted OSINT expert and certified practitioner with the International Institute for Criminal Investigations. She specializes in gender-sensitive, trauma-informed methodologies and the integration of emerging technologies into investigative work. Beyond atrocity crimes, she has investigated sports integrity violations at the World Athletics and conducted OSINT research for U.S. government stakeholders on North Africa. She holds an MA from SOAS University of London and BA in Arabic Studies from Sofia University. Cornelia, welcome to the Intelligence Spotlight series.
It's a pleasure to be here, Qais. Thank you so much for having me. And of course, thank you so much for this detailed and generous introduction.
Glad that you're here. So a question I want to pose for you, probably you won't expect that much. What's the first thing you hate about Mondays?
That is the beginning of another work week. That the weekend is over and that I will actually have to focus on substantive work rather than just enjoying my hobbies.
Right. Definitely. It's always start of the week and lots to do. So many of our listeners know institutions like the UN or the IIM, but they rarely get to hear the personal journey behind the roles, people who are working there. It's often the story of how someone ends up in this line of work as you are, and how it connects. So maybe tell us a bit about yourself, what inspired you, pushed you to work in your current field.
Thank you for this question. So in my case, I would say that I don't have a very typical profile for a professional who ends up working in this type of organizations. And I somewhat stumbled into this field of work, mainly because I did, as you mentioned earlier in the introduction, my Arabic studies, which was essentially focused on the linguistic part, so mastering modern standard Arabic, and also on the socio-political and cultural dynamics in the Middle East. After that, I delved a little bit deeper into Near and Middle Eastern studies, studied human rights and Islamic law, and my decision was largely informed by the fact that back in 2011, with the beginning of the Arab Spring, I was on a student exchange program in Jordan, and I got to witness firsthand how some of the mass protests were tackled by governmental agencies. And I think this is where my curiosity and strong sense of justice started to emerge. And this is why I decided to go into human rights. Actually, before that, I was more thinking that I would combine the language expertise with something a little bit more mainstream, like business or marketing. But indeed, the Arab Spring was a defining moment for my future career. And fresh out of university, I landed my first job with the Commission for International Justice and Accountability, which was investigating war crimes and crimes against humanity in Syria. And this is where I received my professional training into conducting investigations that meet, criminal thresholds. And naturally, when several years later, in December 2016, the IIIM on Syria was established by the General Assembly, I decided to apply because I have accumulated this country expertise by having worked on this type of work for nearly 3 years. And also because after that, I got a fairly traditional training in open source intelligence. I was working for the United States government for, again, 2 years. So I thought that this blend of expertise would actually contribute greatly to the work that the IIIM Syria is mandated to do. And this is how I decided to apply. And luckily, I was selected for the role. That is in short.
Well, that's quite inspiring, and I think there's a lot to unpack there, especially when it comes to your work from media monitoring to international investigations, and now which Syria is and has been at the heart of much of your work. So what first drew you into the world of investigations in intelligence analysis, and specifically how that links to the path which led you to specifically focus on Syria?
Right. So, as I mentioned, when I was working for the Commission of International Justice and Accountability, we were conducting different investigations into of crimes. And that was back in 2014 when the work of Bellingcat was just starting to pick up. So, naturally, I was following what's happening in the Syria space, and they have done a lot of open source investigations into different incidents, from the use of different types of munitions that are not allowed under criminal law, to the use of prohibited chemical substances, but also investigating other incidents such as particular shootings of civilians or torture in detention. And I got inspired to actually read their blog and to learn about the techniques that they were using so that I can supplement the work that I am doing in the context of the investigations that were being conducted at CJ at the time. And I quickly realized that there is a lot of potential that is not being tapped into, in all these publicly available information. As an analyst and investigator of core international crime, open source investigation was mainly used to, supplement and corroborate closed source information. Nonetheless, it has proved to be very powerful. And especially when we're talking about identifying information relevant to the contextual elements of the crimes that are under investigation.
Well, that's it. When Syria was going through different phases of conflict, because even now the atrocities continue under different circumstances, and it's unlike other conflicts. Syria stands out because of the sheer amount of also material that are available, like videos, photos, witness statements. Also, many NGOs have a lot of archives, but more doesn't always mean easier as well, right? So if there are more content, more material available, it's also a lot of work. And Syria has been described as one of the most heavily documented conflicts in history. In your line of work and from your perspective, how does that amount of digital and testimonial evidence both can help but also complicate accountability efforts?
Yeah, that is true indeed. Syria is one of the most well-documented conflicts. And honestly, it's both a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing because potentially you have this trove of information that can be mined and exploited and analyzed in support of different investigations or legal proceedings. So there is always the hope that if you dig deep enough and if you apply the adequate structured methodology about data exploitation, you would be able to find information of relevance to a particular investigation or national proceeding. At the same time, it's a curse because you only have that much resources. And I'm talking both in terms of human resources, like analysts and investigators that can dedicate their time to identify, collate, and review and annotate this information so that they can make sense of it, but also about hardware and software. All of these organizations, be it like fact-finding missions or quasi-prosecutorial body, as is the IIIM on Syria, they have limited resources. And to conduct this type of complex, large-scale international organizations, you really need a lot of resources. Sadly, this is a daily reality for us. How do we make the best use of the limited resources that we have with a view to making sense of this huge trove of information in which you can literally get lost into? And
Right.
something that I want to highlight, which is also particularly challenging, is how do you go about the exploitation of multimedia? So, as you mentioned, we're not talking only about textual information or witness testimonies, which, arguably the exploitation of text-based records and documents is relatively more easier. There are already established and traditional ways to go about it. But multimedia, so including audio files, video files, images, this is unstructured data that doesn't lend itself to, easy exploitation. So I would say this is something that the field is still pretty much struggling with. And even though there are some promising developments, there is no easy way to go about it and to analyze this large volume of information in a way that would be sufficiently organized so it can, directly feed into certain investigations or criminal proceedings without doing the analytical drudgery work.
Right. So maybe I think it's worthwhile if you could share an example, of course, without breaching the confidentiality of the line of work you have. If you have an example how OSINT or multilingual digital evidence has been pivotal in corroborating witness accounts and what they saw, and then also having those evidences. Do you have any example in mind?
Yeah, actually, there are multiple public examples in the context of Syria because there has been a lot of work going on, especially at the domestic level.
Mm-hmm.
And probably off the top of my head, one very prominent example that I can think of because it was utilized in quite a few cases is the Caesar file, which is this collection of images that were smuggled out of Syria by a photographer. It features very distressing content. The corpses of detainees that were most probably mistreated and tortured in various military intelligence branches in Syria and some military hospitals. So this file was actually analyzed by different experts. And some of these images were included in case files. In particular, I can cite two public cases in Germany. There is a landmark case against Anwar Raslan. The other one is a more recent case against Syrian doctor.
Mm-hmm.
Also convicted. So this is one example where, photo evidence that has been corroborated, whose authenticity has been verified and established by experts, had
Right.
been used to advance justice efforts. Another case that I personally supported while I was working for the IIIM on Syria
By the
is.
way, can you give me the date of when those cases were exactly in Germany?
Yes, so I think the conviction for the Ala Musa case was announced earlier this year. I want to say May or June. And the Anwar R case, it was the first case that Germany took on Syria. It's also famous like the Koblenz case. It was like
Because
definitely earlier.
right, I remember. Yeah, there was a case of a Syrian military general. I don't remember the name, which I think might be it's him. He fled to Germany as an asylum seeker. But then his case actually served as one of the biggest landmark international accountability cases, which it was a hope for a lot of countries, a lot of institutions that international jurisdiction is still can be implemented. So I think that given that case was a landmark one, it's incredible. So yeah, please continue.
Yes, no, that's right. And actually, to build upon what you were saying, the fact that certain national jurisdictions are able to investigate and prosecute core international crimes that were committed outside of their own territory is rendered possible by the application of this legal principle, universal jurisdiction. So all of these cases that I was talking about, they're universal jurisdiction cases. This principle, although it's, implemented in slightly differently, there are different prerequisites, but basically the underlying idea is that certain crimes are so grave, so egregious that they are deemed crimes against the international community. So irrespective of whether the crime took place on the territory of a different country, and maybe even the country that is applying the universal jurisdiction principle have a suspect on their territory per se, or none of their citizens were victims of those crimes, they still, depending on how they have implemented the universal jurisdiction principle into their laws, they can still investigate and prosecute crimes. And I think this has been a very prominent development in the case of Syria because of the stalemate situation with the referral of the Syrian case to the ICC. So relying on this type of universal jurisdiction cases is definitely one way in which survivors and victims to core international crimes can seek recourse. And it's definitely an alternative avenue to justice that has to be exploited in complex situations where the more traditional international justice bodies cannot be enabled.
Right. Yeah. And I think there's also this key difference between investigations that usually inform the public or is used for reports or at the UN General Assembly, but also there are the type of investigations that directly feed into courts and prosecutions, right? And usually their findings are then told and reports or at the UN General Assembly, or generally if it's really a matter of public interest. So in your line of work and given the experience you have, so how do these approaches differ between the UN fact-finding missions and their mechanisms, like the IIIM that have a more prosecutorial mandate? So how do they differ?
Yes, that's a very interesting question. And I think among the wider public, there is a little bit of confusion as to what the function and mandate of the different UN bodies is. So perhaps let me first start with the fact-finding missions, or the so-called, truth-seeking commission of inquiries. So these bodies, they are normally set up to investigate and report on patterns of violence by different parties of a conflict. So their mandate is to establish the facts surrounding a particular incident or a particular situation. And normally they're mandated to report on their findings in a public report, which is usually presented to the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly.
Right.
So these fact-finding missions, they don't build trial-ready case files. Their work actually helps to establish a historical record, to identify perpetrators if possible, and kind of to keep the particular situation on the international agenda so that decision makers and politicians can take informed decisions. In contrast, bodies with quasi-prosecutorial mandates, such as the IIIM on Syria, and later on the UN established some other bodies with very similar mandates, for example, the mechanism on Myanmar, and also the mechanism that was looking into crimes committed by the Islamic State. Their function is to actually, and again, broadly speaking, their mandates can be quite unique depending on how they are articulated in the resolution on the basis of which they have been established. But in general, their mandate is to collect, preserve, consolidate, analyze information, and then build case files that can be directly used to support the work of other international, regional, hybrid, or national courts. So let's put it this way, their standard of proof is much higher than those that has to be followed by fact-finding missions and commissions of inquiries. They have to actually perform their investigations to a criminal standard so that the gathered information and the case files that they have built can actually be admitted to court once or if they get submitted. And that is one of the core differences. So they are built with different purposes in mind. One, the fact-finding missions are more about awareness raising and the establishment of factual information surrounding particular incidents or conflict situations, while the quasi-prosecutorial bodies, which are kind of these new generation of international accountability mechanisms, they're more oriented towards supporting the work of courts.
Right, right. When I looked at your LinkedIn, there was a term e-discovery. What is that exactly?
Yeah, e-discovery is basically, it stands for electronic evidence, and it's this system that is used to manage, organize, store, and of course, analyze and produce different analytical and investigative outcomes. It was development that started off in corporate litigation, but has since been moved to be used in the investigation of atrocity crimes.
I see.
And essentially, it provides a framework in which the gathered digital information can be organized in a way that will again serve certain investigative and prosecution needs. There are different databases that are operating within this framework. The one that I have used more heavily is Relativity. So it provides different functions that enable practitioners to record in an efficient way, not only the actual record, the piece of information or evidence that can be shared for prosecutorial needs, but also the metadata, which of course is a critical component of ensuring that this piece of information can be admitted to court. Because what's the point of collecting all this data if you cannot establish its provenance and the proper chain of custody, and if you don't have the thorough metadata information, so that if defense team actually makes claim that this digital file has been altered or tampered with, you have all the necessary evidence to demonstrate that no, actually this is this piece of information is authentic, and here are the notes as to why.
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting how today's world, technology, and particularly, I think we are in a new revolution in our world. We had the industrial revolution, and I think then it was digital revolution, and we're going through an AI revolution at the moment. What innovations and technologies are currently changing the way international crimes are being investigated?
Yes, so
Particularly, I think it connects to the previous conversation of e-discovery. So it was, for
yes.
me, it was a question how technology is still and will be used in this line of work.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great transition. So there has been indeed a lot of advancement in different analytical and investigative tools that can be deployed, especially in the context of, e-discovery, so that information can be identified and retrieved in a more efficient and timely manner. And here I'm talking about first something that is not so revolutionary, but nonetheless has tremendously changed the work of analysts and investigators when we're talking about data retrieval, for example. Some of these powerful softwares, they offer more sophisticated search capabilities, especially when you're working in a database that features over millions of evidentiary items. How do you locate the information that may be of potential relevance to the case or investigation you're working on? That's why I think the progress in data retrieval tools and techniques has made an enormous difference and has enabled analysts to be a little bit more adequate about the identification of information in a vast sea of digital records. Also, when we're working with multilingual data, it's critical. So one very specific, and it's one of my favorite tricks to use to retrieve information, is using the fuzzy searching, which is this search capability that allows the system to retrieve information that may have contained some typographical errors. It's particularly handy when you are working with material that has been transcribed or translated. And with non-European languages, such as Arabic, that has very specific orthographical characteristics, transliteration can be honestly a nightmare because there is no one single transliteration convention on how to render Arabic characters into Latin languages. So how the name of a location or a person or an entity is transliterated into English will depend pretty much on the level of education of the person who was doing the rendering. It would depend on whether they're an English speaker or a French speaker. We're talking about audio and video files, the quality of the file. If we're talking about optical character recognition, which is this capability that allows the extraction of text from scanned documents.
All right.
Again, the quality of its output would depend on the quality of the scanned image and on the original. Are there any faults, any smears, any smudges? Are there any handwritten annotations? All of this translates and has a bearing on the quality of the output. And of course, unfortunately, in some cases, these materials cannot be retrieved and used simply because they're not searchable, just because your search queries and strategies cannot cast a net so wide that it will manage to sweep everything in. But there are a lot of exciting developments in this space. More recently, with AI-powered tools for translation and transcription, there have been some positive developments that can be somewhat helpful in the exploitation of multilingual data. For example, before it was very, very difficult for translation tools to identify different languages that feature in the same video. Now there are steps that are being taken in that direction, and there is definitely a better output. I am on the camp that is very, very cautious of all of these new developments. I think they should be taken with a pinch of salt. There are a lot of vendors that are trying to resolve pain points, real problems that analysts and investigators face. But I think the utility and the effectiveness of these tools have to be assessed on a case-by-case basis. And particularly with a view to the type of investigation you are running, what is your desired outcome, and what is the context on which you are working. Because I can give you a very recent example. I was attending a hackathon, and the participants were given access to very interesting geolocation tool, which on the demo was performing absolutely amazingly because it was trained on US data.
Right.
When we got to deploy it on the context that we were working on, which is a country that is outside, of Europe and America, where the development these tools and the underlying data on which they're trained happens, the performance significantly dropped. So I think this is something very important. What is the data that certain new emerging AI-powered tools are trained on? And would this data actually help you to make meaningful findings in a context that is far removed from the context from which the data was collected?
Exactly. And in the case of geolocations, it's my expertise, like geospatial analysis. I find it quite shocking, but also I understand like how information differ, like geospatial information. When you want to geolocate a place, an incident in the US or generally in the northern hemisphere, it's so easy to do it. Why? Because you have a lot of footage, you have a lot of searchable items, you have a lot of Google Street Views, which allows you to do it, and the very latest ones. But also, like, of course, Google Street View is available in most other countries as well, and not just in the northern hemisphere, but also in Africa, in Asia, but of course, there are so many other countries that still it's not available. But the ones that are available are very outdated, like 12 years ago, 15 years ago. That's one of the challenges I believe a lot of investigators have, especially those who are working on a country that they are not from. And usually they need to retrain their own skills in that area to understand the context and the architecture and the whole how images would look like in a country, and completely a different methodology that they need to employ. And AI particularly has been somehow helpful, but not at all when it comes to places like Syria, like Afghanistan, like Sudan and other places. They would just give you a very random answer. Even in the case of US, there was a picture of a guy in a Tesla, but he had a plate number of Afghan plate number because it was his car. Of course, he did it. He customized it. But then he was in California, right? He was just chilling, and then I wanted to
You
know
do.
where exactly in California that is. So what AI did was it only picked up that plate number and said, yeah, it matches with the green, with the mountainous regions of Afghanistan, look at, and things like that, which it was I was like shocked, like, look, one indication of maybe something unrelated to that location would immediately the AI would give you that judgment in a very confident way. So those I think you can also give your advice on people who are trying to get into the investigation world, which things they need to be careful of, because AI gives you so much confidence that I've seen people using completely AI for their investigation, then they calling themselves OSINTers or investigators, and while they haven't produced anything original, obviously AI can produce you very detailed OSINT reports. It can give you geolocations, everything, because it uses the data that is already available, but it doesn't have the context of the human brain. It doesn't have the understanding, the nuance, and a lot of it. Of course, a lot of people in the area know why it lacks it and how the human judgment plays a huge role in all of that. So maybe this is a good question as well for people who want to get into this career if they're interested. So what steps should they take at this time and age, specifically how the world is changing in terms of job market, in terms of how they're less focused on accountability and human rights? How should they navigate this whole world of investigations, fact finding, and particularly if they want to work for the UN?
No, that's a great question. Thank you so much for posing it. And actually, your observations cover pretty much mine. And as I said earlier, I think AI-powered tools, and again, AI is such a broad umbrella term. There are different categories within this label that we have to be mindful for. But all of them should be explored with a pinch of salt. And I think what's really important for not only OSINT practitioners, but for, members of the general public is to read upon what AI actually constitutes. Like, are we talking about machine learning? Are we talking about generative artificial intelligence? Are we talking about computer vision? And then what each of these subcategories can and cannot do. And once you understand the mechanics of, for example, how LLMs are powered, what they're trained on, you would be much more reluctant to rely on AI, especially in the strategic thinking part of your assignment. I also want to say I really feel uncomfortable with relying on AI automation for the identification of sources, because AI is a black box. You don't know what it has access to. Some models purport that they're searching the internet, but we have absolutely no idea what corners of the internet are they searching. Are they familiar with the particular information landscape in the country that you're investigating? And as you mentioned earlier, there are different particularities about the different information context, like what is the internet penetration level? Is technology actually widespread? Is this your best route of finding information? So when you don't know how AI is mapping the sources of information, how
Right.
it is, making a decision as to what has to be collected and what is relevant, it's a big red flag for me. Like, when we're talking about the traditional OSINT craft, this is such a crucial component. You have to go through
Uh-huh.
the whole intelligence cycle, and you have to ensure that your methodology is not only replicable, but also defensible. And when you kind of delegate this part of the work to an AI, and you cannot explain what methodology it relied upon, I really would put a lot of doubt in the findings. This being said, I'm very pro new tech. Why I said this is because I think there should be a lot of critical thinking when you are approaching this type of tools. There are certain areas where AI can indeed facilitate the work of analysts and investigators. For example, myself, because I'm a non-native English speaker, sometimes and the reports and written outputs that I draft, they're highly technical. So if I want to run a particular para just to make sure that I nail the exact words, I will do that, as long as it doesn't, of course, contain confidential information. This is the other thing. I mean, when you're working with sensitive data, do you really want to put it in an LLM? So all this being said, I want to stress that I am not against new and emerging technologies. I just want to stress the importance of having, a critical approach when you are assessing their suitability, utility, and effectiveness in the context of the investigation you are conducting. And despite all the potential pitfalls and concerns that I have about certain AI-powered technology, there are a lot of great cases where AI can actually facilitate the work of analysts and investigators. Myself, for example, as a non-native speaker, sometimes I use it to make sure that the language I've used, because I normally have to produce very technical reports that require familiarity with highly specialized language, and if it doesn't contain any sensitive data or confidential information, I would very conveniently drop it in an LLM to make sure that it sounds polished
Uh-huh.
and that each word is accurately used. Again, this being said, sometimes I've noticed that LLMs, on the one hand, they have the tendency to present information in a highly confident manner. The other, they have the tendency to oversimplify the text. I've noticed that particular reports that required very nuanced and caveated wording, when I've run it through an LLM, they just completely strip it of the nuance and they come up with these very straightforward and blunt statements, which is completely unacceptable in the context of, for example, human rights investigations reports or investigative reports in the context of criminal investigations. Like you
Right.
really need to be very accurate in the way you present information, and you have to provide all the necessary nuance. And this is something that I've noticed can be lost on LLMs, because let's face it, I mean, it's mainly used for marketing copy. It has to be catchy, it has to be punchy, it has to be clickbaity. But this is not the type of writing that we aim at in our line of business.
Right.
The other thing that I've noticed AI can be very helpful with, especially if you're using it on your own data, is, for example, pattern recognition, network analysis. It can be quite helpful about data cleaning. So again, very, tedious aspects of the work where it can give you a leg up. So you should totally use it, provided that you've done a thorough assessment of the suitability, utility, and effectiveness of the particular tool.
Definitely, yeah. So
Sorry to put you short. Something very important that I want
yes, you
to
can.
emphasize in the
Yeah,
context of
shoot it.
of the utility, because I've noticed that a lot of OSINTers are using it when they are navigating context with a different language, and they rely on the translation, on the translated material. And here again, I would be very cautious, because some of the crimes that we're investigating are committed in contexts whose languages are sort of undersourced when we're talking about translation and localization. There are no proper lexicons that adequately reflect the richness of the vernaculars, the complexities of the, regional dialects. And this shows in translations. And actually, a very good example for that would be in the case of Myanmar, when content moderation tools that are supposed to, identify and flag content that creates, for example, racial slurs or other derogatory language, passed through the filters and did not get removed because it contains hate speech, for example. But I've had similar experiences when I was working on propaganda by the Islamic State, because their ideological messages are deeply rooted into Islamic law. They are using very, very particular language to denote different minority groups, for example, different religious groups. And these terms are completely butchered, not only by LLMs, but even by more, sophisticated CAT translation tools. So if you don't have the proper contextual understanding when it comes to translations, chances are that you are going to get a lot of things wrong, and you may not reach, the best findings, or worst case scenario, you can come up to completely, unreliable findings. So this is
Absolutely.
something that I think is very important to flag up.
Yeah, absolutely. I do agree. Like having the context it's super crucial in every way. I've seen either like large media companies who are doing fact checking, for instance. They have their fact checking unit. Sometimes they are coming up with fact checks that when I look at it, maybe they have finally reached to the same conclusion that it's whether true or not. But the approach they take sometimes is like out of context, because every country has a lot of nuances, a lot of cultural context, linguistic context, dialectic context as well. When it comes to Arabic, right? Each of the countries, whether that's Syria, Lebanon, let's say from Morocco to Saudi Arabia, okay, they all speak Arabic, but they have complete different dialects. And in each dialect, something means differently. Or sometimes something is said in a sarcastic way, but people think this is not sarcastic, but understanding it. So it's good, like, especially in your line of work, when you're worked on Syria, you also can understand Arabic, right? Which give you the upper hand, and it can give you the how to understand the context overall. So looking ahead, um, this type of work is also not easy, right? It has a lot of emotional toll. You deal with a lot of graphic materials. How to deal with vicarious trauma, especially for people who are starting in this field. What should they expect?
Thank you for this question. It's something that I feel very passionately about because the majority of practitioners in this field actually face distressing content pretty much on a daily basis. And I think having awareness about what vicarious and secondary trauma are can be pretty helpful so that you can identify whether you exhibit specific symptoms that are indicative of this type of trauma. And it's really crucial to be able to identify those symptoms because then you can take informed action and try to find coping strategies and strategies to mitigate those. Obviously, vicarious and secondary trauma manifest differently in different individuals, and coping strategies will vary greatly. But I think now, in comparison, like for example, with 7, 8, 10 years ago, there is a lot of information that is publicly accessible on how you can go about minimizing the risk of, suffering from these. So it's really important to look after yourself. And I know how difficult it is because feelings like guilt and shame very often arise. That has been the case for me, for example, but also overall anxiety, for example, generalized or specific, frustration with your surroundings, and also with the your own inability to actually do something more to help the people who you are trying to serve. So sometimes it can be really difficult to find the right approach to integrate some self-care techniques so that you can mitigate against vicarious and secondary trauma, but it's absolutely crucial. Otherwise, best case scenarios, you will end up burned out. Worst case scenario, you can end up in a very, very dark place with PTSD and whatnot. Because indeed, investigating core atrocity crimes exposes you to the worst part of what humans can do to another fellow human. And it can bring a lot of difficult and hard feelings. So having the right support system, not only institutional, I think that organizations and institutions have a lot more to do in this respect, but also you proactively as an individual, like identifying what, hobby or sport or other activities that put you at ease and doing them every single day so that you have some sort of structure
Right.
is of paramount importance.
Absolutely. Cornelia, thank you so much for being at the Intelligence Spotlight series. It was great to have you.
I thank you so much for having me. It was an absolute pleasure to discuss all these important points with you. Thank you.
Take care.